Ada Louise Huxtable was the first architecture critic for a major American newspaper. And she created this position of talking about architecture to the widest possible audience that really hadn't existed before. And I think for the, 30, 40 years after she started in that critical position, more and more newspapers across America also felt that they had to have an architecture critic. So it really created this public, broad based, kind of like humanistic space for the discussion of architecture as, one of the most important things happening in cities. And she became the architecture critic for the New York Times because she wrote letters to the editor criticizing their coverage. So I think it's really important to see that not only did she shape the discussion once she was in the position, but she basically like wrote her way into that position. So her agency is in the form of writing. It's in the form of elevating the discussion of architecture to being kind of an urgent political and social issue, and then to have the ability to follow those building projects from start to finish. Well, I think she was a really good reporter. I mean, one thing any journalist will tell you is, you have to get out on the street and talk to people. You have to see things with your own eyes. You have to like physically experience things. And I think that's very clear, even, from her earliest work in the New York Times. One of her first pieces was called The Park Avenue School of Architecture. And it's really, she's standing on the sidewalk and describing all of these new buildings, including Lever House and the Seagram building, that are going up on Park Avenue in New York. And you feel the urgency of her position and the urgency of building in the city that day. It's like people, in circa like 1959, 1960, were honestly astonished by how much building was going on in New York City. Like these were the boom times. And I think that's part of the reason the New York Times agreed to let her write. But also she was describing a physical phenomenon that people could see and then kind of, going down the rabbit hole of investigating that. So I think her reportorial skills are really important. She wasn't just, sitting in her apartment with lots of architecture books, thinking about things. She was actually out there talking to people, learning. And I think that's another thing about having a long career, which I feel like is going to be a theme cutting across the women that you're talking about in this exhibition, is the longevity of their careers. They didn't just have one moment. I mean, you talked about kind of going from the modern to the postmodern position, and it's about how can you, approach, like, it's like how can you approach architecture in a way that is flexible enough to ride up and down with the other forces that are affecting architecture. Her last piece was about the very destructive proposed renovation of the New York City Public Library by Norman Foster. And you can tell that she went, she's in her 90s, she's very ill. Like she went to the library to think about like, what does this building mean? How does it feel to be here? And how will these proposals destroy it? So like she knew that that was the only way to do the job. I think the overlap that I see between the three of them is the fact that like the first original thing that they each did was to carve out a position in relation to architecture that maybe wasn't necessarily architecture. I mean, Gaia Lenti was an architect, but a lot of things she did, a lot of her designs don't fall under, capital A architecture or traditional architecture. So I think all of them, it's being drawn to a profession that very clearly at that time was not accepting of women, wasn't necessarily interested in alternative views of practice, didn't have a lot of like niches and edges and curiosities. She was at the pinnacle of her profession, and she was horizontal to the power structures of architecture. And I think you have to credit the fact that she was writing for the New York Times, then, the most important newspaper in America. So that institutional backing is not incidental to how her work was received and how she was able to operate. Like having that force at your back is really important, both I think for one's own confidence as a writer and for what you feel you're able to do and say. I think her most important work was seen both in her time and now, some years after her death, as being her defense of and then her lament for Pennsylvania Station. First, because the way she wrote about the station, kind of as an avatar of the Beaux-Arts era of grand city building, was incredibly moving and lyrical. Like a lot of her work can be very, pugnacious to the point. She was writing for a daily newspaper, but then occasionally she would pause in one of these pieces and just want to make you feel it. And I think that Penn Station piece is one of those places where she was like, okay, I'm not going to be so hard nosed for a minute here. I'm going to talk about the fallen eagles in the meadowlands. These are real symbols of, I think, American ingenuity, the power of city building, and she felt like at that time New York had just abrogated that responsibility. So, and people responded to that piece at the time. People, it's been anthologized a million times. Like people are still responding to that piece. And, almost more importantly than whatever you think about Penn Station and then Madison Square Garden that replaced it, it helped to crystallize the preservation movement both in New York City and in the United States, which has been incredibly important for any numbers of buildings in the 50, 60 years since. So I think it's interesting how a piece about a big neoclassical piece of architecture can end up having an effect on much smaller things. I've been doing some reading about the 1970s and the loft laws in Soho, and she was really instrumental in preserving Soho as the cast iron historical district. And those buildings are utilitarian buildings that were built for industrial purposes. So you wouldn't necessarily think that Penn Station and the Soho historical district had anything to do with each other, but in fact they did, through Ada Louise Huxtable and her advocacy. Modernist architects believed in newness, and they often, at least rhetorically, kind of rejected the past, had no use for the past. And so I think that opening up of criticism of validity in architecture, of preservation as a moving project, was really important. And I think that comes back into play in her last piece, Defending the New York Public Library, where, if you look at Norman Foster's work, he's very indebted to the modernists of the 1960s. And in fact, she admired most of Norman Foster's work stylistically. She just didn't think what he was doing was appropriate for that building. And she was willing, in that case, to prioritize the old architecture over the new architecture. And so I think her experience writing about Pennsylvania Station really allowed her to think hard about, what works, like what is monumentality in the city, what do people want from their public buildings. I think that at least during the bulk of her career, Ada Louise was not a feminist. Like she was exceptional, and she, like many women who actually were successful during the 1960s and 70s, were sort of in another category. And so their success didn't necessarily apply to other people and didn't necessarily extend to other people. There's a very famous lawsuit by a group of women against the New York Times for discrimination, and Ada Louise Huxtable did not join that lawsuit. I think in her later life, she was helpful to and mentored women, but during the kind of time of her greatest power, I think that she, did her own work, helped her own position, but wasn't necessarily helpful to others.